Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson and welcome to Cost Control in Construction. This is lecture 6A, and in this series we're looking at different areas of how we can actually control costs in construction projects. Not just control them, but optimize, find opportunities as we proceed in a project for cost savings, and really be able to monitor our projects as we're tracking them, as we're implementing them, and being very alert to things that are delaying us in a perspective of time and a perspective of cost. And we've also talked about how those two work very closely together. Today's topic is going to be change orders. Now, I kind of jokingly put measure once, cut twice, and the old saying is measure twice, cut once. But sometimes, you know what? When you're doing a project and you get changes thrown at you left, right, and center, it feels like you're cutting twice. It feels like you're having to do things over again. It feels like you're being stalled on your projects. So we need to be able to devise ways and means of being able to better implement changes, better collect the actual costs of the change, and really understand how changes impact and influence our ability to manage projects effectively. It's a big deal in construction. It's a multi-billion dollar sector is change orders. And I often think that contractors think that they're doing better on them than they are. You know, in some of my discussions with groups and consulting, I find that a lot of contractors feel that they're doing really well, or at least employees of contractors feel that there's a lot of money being made on changes. Well, you know what? That's not always the case. So in this series, which will be 3 videos, 6A, 6B, and 6C, on change orders, we'll be looking at the various elements that comes to be, how it impacts us, right? So we want to understand the impact that changes have on our 3 constraints or goals: time, cost, quality. Can also affect other areas, as you'll see in some of the other video lectures when we talk about fatigue and overwork. That can impact safety. For sure affects scope, because that's what you're doing with changes. You're either adding or you're deleting with them. And we want to make sure that we have good documentation that we can substantiate these costs. So we want to be able to better protect ourselves against claims and litigation, and if we need to make a claim, we want to be able to turn those claims into changes that ensure that we don't lose money unnecessarily on our projects, also that we don't create unnecessary adversarial relationships. So some of the topics we will be looking at on the impact of change orders: there's a ripple effect that occurs. There's a real cost of change orders. It's not just always the direct cost. There's other implied costs that go on. We'll talk about consequential costs and consequential impacts. And there's also another one called cumulative impacts that we'll look at. So these areas, and overtime impact on productivity, an often forgotten area. Time sensitivity, the timing of it, and what is the real causes of changes. So when we think about topics, other topics that we'll cover, we have to also think about the direct costs and the indirect costs. Impacts on flow, and we'll talk about flow, labor efficiency. I mentioned the cumulative impacts, overhead, reality of unit prices, and how that can be impacted too by original costings in a contract. So reality is changes are not cheap. Nothing in construction is really cheap. We have very high labor costs, the materials are expensive, and it's not a cheap endeavor. It's not inexpensive for the clients. When they make changes later in the project, it's not saving them money. Those changes are typically, for the most part, there may be some exceptions, but for the most part, they would have been well served if they'd made them earlier on in the design stage, or at the very least in the pre-construction stage. They're also costly for consultants. You have to redraw things, you have to re-engineer things. There may be money in your budget, there may not be money in the budget, depending on what's been going on. And it really interferes with their ability to keep on track, not only for this project that you're working on, but it's also a distraction from other projects that they may be working on. And for contractors, it can be very costly too, as you will see. So the premise of my argument here is that projects run a lot smoother without changes. So if we can minimize the changes, that's a positive. It's a very much a positive. And of course, clients, they can implement changes. They have the right to put a change into a project. Most contracts will agree with that. If it's within the overarching scope of the work that you're performing. It can be debatable whether it's something that's like a separate project onto its own or not related to the work that you're actually doing. But in some ways, those kind of changes very often aren't as bad as changes in the actual work. So the other thing is clients have to be willing to pay for the cost of the changes, but they're not going to be willing to pay unless you're able to prove. So it really comes down, it's a two-way street. And I fully empathize with clients or sympathize with clients because they see all these costs coming and adding up, and whatever contingency they had for changes, maybe 10-15%, it doesn't take long before that disappears, and then they're spending more money than they expected. So fair compensation, though, is something that should be expected from the contractor who is experiencing and having to implement these changes. So let's really try to get a better handle and understanding of the changes. We succeed as contractors by completing projects on budget, on time, to the quality expectation, right? And we need people that have planned out the project. We need to get the right people at the right time, which involves a lot of planning, a lot of coordination to make sure that that's happening. So we put a lot of effort into that. And we have these areas of work that we deal with on a construction project. We go after it. We put in a bid for it. We have an estimate. We have a schedule for that, and then we get awarded the project. And then we take that and we perform a budget. We take that out. We perform a baseline schedule so we can measure how we're progressing. We procure contracts with the subcontractors. We line everything up, and then we start work. And then we construct the project, and then there's the closeout phase. So that's what we're trying to accomplish in a project. We're following this sort of overall process with establishing a baseline for cost and schedule. We're actually doing the work, and we're iterating, we're adjusting, and then we're leading us to closeout with all of these elements occurring as we do it. So there's a definite flow from beginning to end. But you have to remember, where do most changes occur? They're going to occur in this cycle. Most of the changes are going to occur in this cycle. So they're interrupting a lot of the planning that we've done. They're interrupting maybe some of the purchasing we've done. They may be requiring us to do rework on the project. So that can have quite an impact on the project. And so in any business transaction, you really have to think about it from two sides. There's the buyer who wants to protect their interests. The client, they want to make sure that they're not being given high escalated prices or inflated prices, and the seller who wants to be able to do it without losing money. And both will see it exactly from different viewpoints. Now, I've talked before about how to win friends and influence people and putting yourself in the other person's position. It's all the more important with change orders. You got to understand where the other side is coming from, why they're making the change, why they want the change. And then once you have a better understanding of where they're coming from, you need to figure out, well, how do I present my cost, and how do I detail this out, and how do I educate them on these particular areas? And that leads to negotiations, and negotiating and making sure that you can do it in a positive way. Because if you don't, it will turn sour. And contractors are very vulnerable to changes because contractually you're obligated to do the work, and you may not get there may be disagreement on what is a change, and so now it's a claim. And meanwhile, it's something that needs to be done to complete the project. That may require you to do it and then have that claim settled later on. Well, if you're settling it later on, who has the power? You've done the work, the client has the money. That puts you in a very vulnerable position. And so then usually in negotiations, the balance of power is with the other side, the negotiation tends to be that you lose out on that and you don't get full compensation for the work you did. Happens all too often in construction projects. So that's another thing that we have to think about. So a change order, there's all kinds of standard change order forms, CC, related to CCDC, and we have our change order agreement, like processes related to CCDC. Just putting a simple one here, really, you're going to have to log your changes, so you're going to have to keep track of them all. You're going to have to make sure that it's very clear what is being changed, because that's what a change is. It's something that's different on the project from what the contract required you to do. Could be an addition, could be a deletion, but it is changing your contract. And a description and a costing. Now, it might be, you're more than likely have to attach a more detailed costing of the change, maybe spreading out your labor and your materials, etc. So that may require a lot more than this, but this is the idea. And if it's extra, or if it's a credit, if it's a deletion, something being removed. So you should also be establishing what's the previous contract amount, what's the extra amount now with the extra amount adding to it, and now what's the revised contract amount. So the client at all time knows what their total is adding up to. So that's important from that perspective, that there's clarity, with the client. They've signed off, they may be signing off all these little changes and not realizing that they're adding up to almost the price of the original contract. That would not be a good situation from a legal perspective. It may favor the client in that case, because you weren't really transparent with what the costs were changing in total to the contract. In your mind, you might think, well, they signed all these things individually, so they should know. Court systems tend to look that you should be able to demonstrate what it's changing the overall contract to as you go. So that's important, and it really is important to get a sign off before you actually do the work, and an agreement to that, because that means you kind of got more of an even balance of power that way from a negotiating point of view. And, generally, do we benefit from an owner-initiated change? Well, I'm going to put that as a question, because sometimes we do. We definitely do. Sometimes it depends what it is. There's contractors like mechanical contractors. They may go in to do a service call, and there's an expectation that it's going to cost X amount of dollars. They've got a contract for it, but then the client, in discussions with the service technician, determines that, well, maybe they want to replace that piece of equipment. So now, instead of being a $500 service call, it ends up being a $10,000 mini project where they're replacing a piece of equipment. Though that's probably going to be a very positive thing for the company. But on the other hand, if you have a change and it's really impacting your flow of work, and you have to stop work and you have to wait until you get approval, or you get the consultant to come up with a design for it, because now it's impacting that work, that can be really negative to your ability to manage the project. So if we think of clients, many are not that educated on construction projects. Many are, but many aren't. And if they aren't, you have to educate them. Many don't realize that a simple change can have a lot of other impacts. It's just, I'm just changing this little thing. It's not a big deal. So that means you need to educate the client. And I put not schooling of the clients. It was interesting in one of the recent U.S. presidential debates. I think it was the vice presidential debate. One of the parties kind of got upset with the other one and said, "Don't school me on this." And she was pretty right on it, because it was like the other candidate was really schooling her on, this area, but it happened that she was an expert in that area. So maybe the wrong person to try to school. But if you're professional with your clients and you figure out what level they're at, you have to kind of look at the client and you'll build a relationship with them. And the ones that are really educated or understand construction or this specific area of construction, then you can raise the level of detail and information that you're giving them as far as complexity. If you know that they don't know too much, then you've got to speak to them in layperson's terms, something that they can understand, and make sure that you're not making it overcomplicated. Because I'm going to get suspicious if I'm the client and you're just, you know, blabbing away and I don't know a word you're saying. It's not going to be really that impressive to me. It's just going to get me frustrated. So you really need to be able to educate them on what's going on and why perhaps this change is going to cost so much money, being able to explain it in very clear, real terms. So that's an important process. And really, you should have an approach that you want to avoid claims. You want to just get things signed off as changes. A claim is just quite simply an unresolved change. So in other words, you have not been able to get this signed off. It's a claim for extra money because of something that has occurred. Maybe it's a design error. Well, that would require a change in the contract so that you could get paid extra for the cost implications of this design error, which meant you couldn't do work for 2 weeks, but you had all this equipment and things on site and the extra costs that are being implied by that. So my point is this, there's this saying, Occam's razor, and you can look it up on Google, but the razor statement is that other things being equal, simpler explanations are generally better than more complex ones. So if you can put things in simple terms, it's a good thing to do. I try to live by that as a professor in construction management, because you can go really complicated with things. And I don't know that that benefits everybody if there's a simpler, more direct way of explaining it. I'm not saying you don't do complicated things. I'm just saying you look for ways to explain it that's much more graspable. Sometimes it takes the use of metaphors or stories to try to explain something. Sometimes, as we'll talk about in another video, you can use certain tools like management by wandering around or going to Gemba, Gemba walk. Bring the person there so they can see it, you can point to it, and a picture is worth 1,000 words. Or shoot a video and send it to them with a discussion about what's going on there. A picture is worth 1,000 words, rather than sending, schedules and reams of explanations in writing. Sometimes just quickly pointing and explaining, you'll sell them on it, and then you can back it up with the documentation. So Occam's razor definitely helps for that. It's a nice little tool, Occam's razor, that way, if you think about it. So the impact of change orders, we can think, do we benefit? As I said, there's a lot of impacts that come into it. They really don't know. They may not be educated on that, as we said. They don't fully appreciate the detrimental impacts of changes. As a tradesperson, because I started out as a tradesperson, whenever somebody changes something in my head, all these things, I got to do this, I got to fix that, I got to do this, and it's expanding. Whereas the clients, or the consultant, it's just, oh yeah, just take that out. Yeah, you got to take that out, but you got to temporarily support the rest of the house to take that out, and you've got to do X, Y, Z. It's more than just take that out. So you have to think about that in those terms, and you have to be doing that education process, as I mentioned. Now, you as the contractor need to believe that your price is justified and fair. So that's interesting, because a lot of contractors will try to jack up their change orders. Now, the problem with that is that if I'm the client and I'm pretty astute, I'm going to want a breakdown. And then if you break down the price, I might point at certain things, and then if you can't explain them, I'm going to lose trust in you. And that's going to make it much more difficult for you to sell future items. So you want to be very careful that you actually believe in your price, and that if you break it down, you can explain it. I'm going to bet that you didn't really consider everything in your price, and you do have it a bit padded, and it might not even be bad. It's padded to you, but if I actually went and I started detailing everything that you haven't thought about, it probably is going to come out to at least that much and more. And I'm not going to feel I'm unjust in charging that amount because I can easily talk to all those costs. So, and I think that's what happens more often than not in the construction sector with a lot of companies, and that's where they lose. So they don't even believe in their own pricing, yet their own pricing is too low and it's not covering all their costs, if you get my drift. So really negotiating a fair, reasonable resolution that covers your overhead, covers your profit targets is important from this perspective. And you need to be truthful and transparent, as I said. So these are kind of what I've been saying. I won't get into too much detail with that again. Should a change be priced differently than the original estimate? Yeah, it should. There are reasons why they should be they should be priced differently. Number one, what if the change is removing things from a contract? Well, if a change is removing things from a contract, you already did a bunch of planning for that. You may have set up a bunch of things. You may have even ordered some things. And that's going to cause a lot of extra administrative work, and you've spent a lot of it in administrative work. So when you remove the change, when you remove the item, the full value of that item probably shouldn't be included if you've done all this extra work on it already. That work is your cost. You've already utilized that cost. So then what's owing is what's left. That's one thing to consider. Also, if it's new, well, what's all the other things that it's interfering with? It's interrupting the flow of work. It's crowding the site. Maybe you have to work overtime if the client wants you to keep to the schedule. There's a lot of reasons why it wouldn't be valued at the same amount as you normally would value those points. And I always come back to this whenever I'm thinking of this. If we had if we think about it from Henry Ford's, and allegedly, I'm getting into now saying allegedly reported to have said you can have a Model T any color you want as long as it's black. I find the more I dig into some of the sayings that people have purportedly said, there's no 100% evidence that they did, but it does sound about right. And definitely the Model T, that was one of the big things with Ford that really catapulted them. That, of course, the moving assembly line process, and that repetition and not deviating from it. The Model T did not change appreciably for a long time. They really waited too long, to be honest, because GM started coming up with different models, the model year, the different colors of vehicles, and so by the time Ford got to it, they were actually a little bit behind GM. But in the beginning, because they were innovators in this area, it was a great run while it lasted. Cars, though, today still, you can have package A, package B, package C. You can't say, oh, I only want the sunroof in package B. I don't want the Bose speakers. Oh, no, sir. Sorry, that's part of package B. You don't have a choice. Things are streamlined. In construction, not a chance. In construction, changes are occurring all the time. Several reasons. We've got a certain level of complexity in construction, and we miss things. We're not making 20 million Model Ts, right? So maybe in the first few thousand, they were able to tweak things, adjust things, and get their flow and everything, so they didn't have to worry about changes once they got all the bugs worked out, and it kept just getting better and better. So definitely we respond to and react to things. And change orders, we've talked about in other classes, proactive and reactive management. Change orders have that effect. They put you into reactive because you weren't expecting it. You didn't know that particular change was going to come, and you have to replan it, and you have to figure out how this is going to affect everything else in your plan. You have to adjust other things. So then it has a ripple effect. Different subcontractors have to change what they're doing. So it really has that impact on projects. Construction industry is really the only one that does that. One of my clients uh, production home builder did lots and lots of houses. At a certain point, they had a certain fee that, if a client after this stage of the house being built wanted to make a change, if they could make a change, it was going to be, they had to pay this fee and then the cost of the change. And it wasn't that they were trying to make money on it. It was that they were frustrated when people changed things later on, and it would wreck their flow and they would make mistakes. And so the client would make a change. They changed the color of the countertop, the granite countertop. And then for whatever the reason, the builder made a mistake and they put the original one in. And then the client wanted, a discount, or they wanted the other one in. And it just became very frustrating exercise. So they tried to curb that, and they would be upfront with the client and say, this is you got a $500 fee if you want to make a change. Even if the change is only $100, that's the $500 fee if you make it after this point. And we will notify you, and we will tell you many times about make your decisions final at this point. And they would even hire designers to help so that they would not make any design errors that way, like as far as color schemes, etc. So they were very proactive at trying to reduce the amount of changes. Because they're a production builder, they're not a custom home builder. Custom home builder, you'd have a problem with that. This is a custom home. This is what the client wants. And most of us in construction are more towards the custom home builder side than the production. So that's kind of where that comes in with changes. So when we think about change orders and impacts, we have to think about what's our labor productivity. We have to know what that is. And it's good if we've got that all well documented and we've got a real target schedule. Because that's also important. If we've done that really well, sometimes on project where there's a major interruption or change or design error, you can sort of show on the schedule updates how the productivity was going up to that point. It's called the measured mile. You can measure a section. Everything was going this way. Everything was going this way. Everything, boom, change. Now it slowed everything down as a result of this change. That is a cost impact to us. That's outside the actual change work itself. So we need to have the good basis in our plan so that we can show and demonstrate when things interrupt our plan. If we don't have a well thought out plan and a good layout and those kind of things, then it's hard to show the impacts. Prefabrication, you can imagine, we've talked about building information modeling and how that can help in pushing for more prefabrication, how it can help with lean construction methodology. We can have more things going on off-site. We can improve quality. But that's not going to be great if all of a sudden there's changes that are meaning that a lot of the things that we prefabricated no longer work. Big costs, big interruptions. So the client needs to know that those costs are there. And we're not saying that you can't make those changes. What we're saying is we need to be able to document how much it is impacting the project and put a cost to it so that the changes reflect those costs that we are incurring. So when we think about being successful in the construction business, it's the ability to nurture beneficial relationships, really having good relationships. And that's that trust, that transparency, that's being sincere in your pricing, not overinflating costs on changes, but not undercosting things either, right? That's the other area. And it does become complex when you negotiate and you have different clients. Some clients, quite honestly, unless they can cut you down a little bit in price, they feel like they've lost. So there's different mechanisms for dealing with clients, but at the end of the day, whatever the signed off agreement is, it should be in a zone that makes you profitable, that it's not taking away from your profit on your projects, because that's the first thing that goes in projects when we do that. All right. And there's some contractors that they believe that they can get a job, low bid it, and then they'll make it up on changes. That is a very interesting way of thinking, my friend. Thinking that you can actually lowball a price, and then make up the rest of the money on changes. So if we take an example here, you have a $1 million contract, let's say, and it's taken for 900,000 in the anticipation that we'll make money on changes. All right. Well, if we take a 20% gross income on sales, right? Gross income is overhead and profit. So that's what you're marking up your direct costs of the project with, right? So assuming that you have 20% gross income on sales, what sort of sales volume would you need? Because we need to cover our overhead when we have extra work, because that's probably, if we're a limited size of company, that's probably limiting other projects we can do. So 20%, well, we would need another $500,000 to increase the contract volume in order to simply break even. What is the likelihood of that? What is the likelihood of that we would get another $500,000 in changes? And even if we do, we're only back up to where we would have been if we'd priced it properly in the first place. And when you're doing all of those changes through that process, guaranteed that client is going to think this, you're a change order contractor, you're inflating prices, I never want to do work with you again. That is playing the short game. That is going to drive you out of business. It's going to drive you out of business because, number one, they're not going to sign off on $500,000 of changes that you're trying to unethically get from them. And number two, they're gonna be looking at you like you are the worst contractor ever, right? So that's not the way to do it. And if you think about how it works in an income statement, you have your income statement. This is your sales. This is your cost of sales. So this is what's going on in the project. These are all your costs on the project. And then this is your gross income, right? Gross income, gross profit. This we are marking up by a certain percentage to allow for overhead and profit. So this difference here, that's our gross income. That gross income better be in a year from all our projects able to cover all of our head office requirements, the estimating on projects that you're never going to get, the accounts receivable, accounts payable, all of these things that your business has. If it's a big construction business, your HR department, all of these other areas, right? And at the end of the day, you have only so much that is left for net income. And it's usually a small amount of the overall amount. And when your projects go kind of south on you, meaning that you have extra costs that you didn't expect or impacts on parts of the work, the first thing that goes is your profit. So if this is getting bigger, the first thing that's getting smaller is this. Eventually, if this disappears, then you're not even paying your overhead. So then it's really not good. So, and if it gets really bad, then you're losing off your direct costs as well. So that's the way that works. It's this that's going to be the part that's going to be expanding unexpectedly when you don't fully account for the impacts. So it's definitely, as I said, if you're that kind of contractor, this is what the client's going to think about you, and they'll never want to deal with you again. You might end up with litigation, and the only ones winning in litigation are the lawyers. So what causes changes? Additions, deletions to the contract, changes in sequence, was interrupted. All of a sudden, client says you can't go in there for the next 2 weeks. We've got this going on. That wasn't anywhere in the contract. We expected we'd have that. We got to demobilize. We got to remobilize. Here's the cost. Changes in methods, materials, designs, any of those could come down the road. You're excavating, you find bedrock when you didn't expect bedrock. Schedule changes coming out of different reasons. Maybe client implied due to design error, impacts from other trades. Maybe they have other trades on the project. If you're a trade contractor, like a sub-trade, and you're contracted with a GC, well, you were supposed to have this area to work, and now you can't do what you need to do. This other trade piled all their stuff in there. There can be these kind of impacts that go on. So that could be between a change between a GC and a subcontractor. And the client might have nothing to do with that one. That would be between the subcontractor and the GC. So those are kind of the main elements that I wanted to cover in this section. And you'll join me for lecture 6B, and we'll get on with some more areas in change orders. And we will look at how it impacts a schedule when you insert a change into a schedule. We call that a fragmented network when that happens. We'll be looking at that in one of my Microsoft project tutorials. So this is Tom Stephenson for now, wishing you happy change orders and a happy day. Change orders are tricky, and we'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Bye for now.